Hello, and welcome to Meet Your Alderman, a podcast that aims to inform Chicago residents about the people that represent them. I'm Sarah Scott, newcomer to Chicago, and surprised there's no consensus amongst our interviewees on the best pizza place in town.
And I'm Eric Eber, a lifelong Chicagoan who is pushing hard to make ketchup on hot dogs a criminal offense.
We had the opportunities to speak to Alderman Harry Osterman of the 48th Ward, a North Side ward that includes Uptown, Andersonville, and Edgewater. It's also home to Montrose Beach, perhaps the best beach on the North Side, in Eric's humble opinion.
Perhaps the most unique thing about Alderman Osterman is that he grew up around politics. His mother, in fact, was a former alderman of the same ward, and he has spent his entire career in politics. Not just a large portion, his entire career has been representing the North Side, or working for representatives of the North Side. So he's been around a while and he's seen a lot. Currently in his third term as alderman, he has a lot to say about policing and the appropriate level of civilian oversight, the important role of CPS schools, and the challenges and prospects for economic development.
On this last point, we spoke directly about aldermanic privilege. Alderman Osterman prefers the term prerogative, but they're the same thing. Loyal listeners will certainly remember this concept, but we'll do a quick recap anyway. Here are the important points about aldermanic privilege. 1, it allows aldermen to control development in their ward. They are effectively the final authority on whether something gets built or not. And 2, it's just a tradition. There is nothing written about it in the law or on the books. Instead, aldermen and city council have, by custom, tended to adhere to the wishes of a ward's alderman rather than veto an initiative, which, by the way, city council actually has the power to do.
City council recently voted to overrule a Northwest Side alderman, an uncommon rebuke to aldermanic privilege, and Alderman Osterman actually mentions this during the interview. He also mentioned that aldermanic privilege has been used for nefarious reasons in the past. Now, we didn't dig as deep into this matter as we probably should have, but the conversation did raise a question about whether this privilege is still appropriate. Can aldermen be trusted to use this power only for good? It is certainly a nuanced and complicated matter that we only scratch the surface of in this discussion. As always, check the show notes for more information on the 40th Ward and Alderman Osterman. We'll also have more links about civilian oversight of the police as well, which we discussed in length during the interview.
Alderman Osterman, we're both really excited to learn more about what inspired you to do all of the public service that you do every day.
Perfect. One of the great parts about my neighborhood is it's kind of a melting pot, and it's always been a melting pot. It's kind of been a port of entry. The Swedes were here many, many years, kind of founded the Andersonville community. But in recent decades, we've had Cubans that came in the 60s and early 70s. We had many people come to the Argyle Street area during the Vietnam War and post-Vietnam War. So it's got a very rich tradition of Asian American residents. And we've had refugees from Bosnia. So it's kind of, I'm expecting that we'll have Ukrainian refugees that will find our neighborhood. It's very welcoming. So it's a place where you can walk down the street and see people from every background and ethnicity, and everyone feels welcome.
Right. Yeah. And we'd love to kind of hear about what initially inspired you to become an alderman in the first place. I know that you are a lifelong resident of Chicago, and so we'd love to hear a bit more about that backstory.
So the backstory is our community, kind of the arc of our community history in the last 50 years was that we had a lot of strong women leaders. I'm the only alderman who's a male alderman from the 48th Ward in the last, I think, 50 years. My mother, Kathy, was a community leader, a block club leader, a mom, like many moms who wanted a better life for her 2 boys and got very involved as kind of at a grassroots level. So she was an alderman for 2 years in the 80s. Harold Washington was the mayor. She was there, served with Harold Washington for 2 years, and then was there and kind of part of the process to, when he passed away, to kind of replace him. So I saw at a young age kind of what it was like in government. So in my life, I was at a young age a community activist. We had a big, strong block club called the Edgewater Community Organization, Community Council, which is kind of the big umbrella group in our community. Served on the board, was the board president at a young age. And then an opportunity came where I could become a state representative. Through all of that, I focused on the opportunity to become the alderman of the 48th Ward. And I think that in Chicago, uniquely, an alderman who is working closely with the community residents, business owners, has a real chance to impact positive change in their community. And that was kind of really what I wanted to do as someone who grew up here and now have my kids here. 11 years ago, I ran for alderman and was successful and have been reelected twice since then.
So your entire life has pretty much been entirely in politics. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we've talked to quite a few aldermen who've spent a lot of time in politics or community organizing, but I think you're the first one that we've talked to whose entire career has been entirely in politics and local politics specifically.
I'm born and raised here. So I've been elected in elected office for 22 years. Before that, I worked in government. I worked for Mary Ann Smith, who was my predecessor at a young age. So I've been involved kind of my whole life, lived in the neighborhood. And all of those things, like many careers, kind of are building blocks. For me, it was building blocks to see what things that needed to happen in a positive way. People can look at our community today and say it's thriving on a lot of different levels, but that wasn't always the case. I was incredibly fortunate that people like Marion Bellini, who was elected in the 70s, my mother, and then Mary Ann Smith, I followed all of them. And all of them had done significant things to kind of move our community forward. So by the time I became the alderman, I had a great deal of momentum from a community level.
Yeah, so you mentioned you were elected back in 2011, and we'd love to hear about how your role has changed over the past decade. What are some challenges you've had to overcome and also some accomplishments that you're most proud of?
So great question. So I think I really came in and my focus was public safety first and foremost, to make it safe in our neighborhood, and focus on a couple core streets. When I was elected, we, like every community, there's gang activity and drug activity, and have really been able to focus on tamping all of that down. So I think that our community is one of the lower crime districts in the city of Chicago. I focus on small businesses, focus on Broadway, have it be a walkable neighborhood so people can walk to small businesses. And we were able to recruit and bring in probably over 150 businesses over my time as alderman. Really trying to focus on our public schools so that our public schools thrive, and that young families, when their kids got to be kindergarten, didn't decide to move outside of Chicago. We've got outstanding local public schools. We've got a couple private grade schools. And then the other thing is we have Senn High School. And Senn High School, when I became the alderman, there was a military school. The Rickover Naval Academy was part of that physical building. And I really wanted to make sure that Senn was an anchor public school within our community where, again, families who have kids in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were not looking to leave our community. That, and I think public transportation has been something that we really focused on. When I was elected alderman, our community was kind of built around public transportation going back, 80, 90 years. We've got the Red Line North. And at the time I was elected, our CTA stations looked, literally I could physically touch the rebar on the columns. And then Barack Obama, as president, he was able to, in his last week in office, give the city of Chicago over $2 billion to renovate the Red Line North. So right now we're going through construction where they're physically rebuilding from Ardmore to the north all the way to Leland near Wilson Avenue. That work is going to have a transformative effect on development along Broadway, which is our kind of main street in the community.
So a lot of those things, they sound like these are things you've tackled since you've become alderman. And after working so hard, you've seen them come to fruition. I'm curious, though, are there things that came up with your second or third term that really made you reconsider the role that you've played and made you think, wow, I need to look at this differently. I need to tackle this differently?
So that's a great question. To be a good alderman, I think you have to do a number of different things. And I think that part of it is you have to work feverishly on your community. That sometimes means you put blinders on, you put your head down, you work with your local residents, chambers of commerce, because it's not easy. And it takes time, and it takes building coalitions and building will and getting consensus. one of the challenges when you do that is that you don't kind of look up and think about the bigger issues that affect the city of Chicago. Part of what I've been able to do, because of what I would say is some of the success that we've had locally, if people feel the community is going in a positive direction and you're doing all the things that you said, they'll elect you to a second term or third term or a fourth term or beyond. But it's also important that aldermen are not just focused on their own neighborhood, because as a city, we're all interconnected. The ability for me to look at bigger issues around the city, I think, is something that I've really focused on this term and the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years. I chair the Housing and Real Estate Committee. So I've been able to focus on housing issues on the south side and the west side and work with my colleagues. A lot of my focus this term has been on bigger issues, also public safety. I worked very hard to get civilian oversight and passing the Empowering Communities for Public Safety ordinance, which took a long time to get passed. We were able to do it this year. We're in the process of putting together the first commission, the interim commission.
Okay, so we're about to launch into a discussion about civilian oversight of the Chicago Police Department. Before we continue, we're going to give some more background info. There's no way to get around this. This is a complicated, messy issue, but it's also super important for understanding how the city landed where it did regarding civilian oversight.
Two acronyms you will inevitably hear when learning about this are GAPA and CPAC. GAPA, GAPA, which stands for Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, represented a coalition of community-based organizations that advocated for police reform. And CPAC, CPAC, which stands for Civilian Police Accountability Council, was an ordinance first proposed by Alderman Ramirez Rosa of the 35th Ward. Both GAPA and CPAC came into being in 2016 as a response to the police shooting of Laquan McDonald in 2014, as well as other acts of police misconduct.
Generally speaking, the GAPA and CPAC plans both wanted to take some measure of control over police accountability away from a mayorally appointed board and give it to one comprised of Chicago citizens from each of the 22 police districts. GAPA went a step further and advocated for the establishment of district councils. Again, one council for each police district. These councils would advocate on behalf of the citizens in those districts and act, in a way, as a medium between the oversight board, city council, and the people on the ground.
The main point of contention between these two plans was the degree of control granted to the oversight board. More specifically, debate centered around the board's role in approving key leadership positions in the Chicago Police Department, with the CPAC plan granting more veto power than the GAPA plan.
The legislation that passed this last July was the product of seemingly endless debate and constant revision, known as the ECPS ordinance, which stands for Empowering Communities for Public Safety. It includes key aspects of the CPAC and GAPA plans, most notably the district councils. It also establishes an oversight board, although its 7 members are all appointed by the mayor.
In terms of approving power, this ordinance does allow the oversight board to nominate people for CPD leadership roles, as well as recommend policy changes, but essentially veto power remains with the mayor or city council.
The ordinance is a lot more complicated than this, but we have decided to get back to the interview instead of digging further. But like we said, it is important, so we are going to include more links in the show notes about this current ordinance, as well as the long winding trail it took to get passed. Okay, so back to the interview.
Yeah, and so clearly public safety has been a huge topic in national debates. Because you've been in for a few terms now, we really wanted to give listeners an overview of the GAPA versus CPAC debates. And I know you were initially in support of GAPA over CPAC.
I think that the core came down to this. I think there were 2 models. One was kind of direct election to a commission, and one was kind of to elect local representatives who would then be a part of a citywide group to appoint people to a commission. The goal in that was to try to get consensus on who would be on this commission. Right now, it's all mayoral appointment. This would be more community grounded. How it ended up was a lot of compromise together with both sides of the coalition, which ultimately got us the ordinance that we passed. We're going through this application process right